The town of Haller's Crossing had a particular way of disposing of things it no longer wanted. It did not burn them the way some frontier towns did, consuming their failures in orange columns of smoke visible from 3 counties away. No, Haller's Crossing simply stopped looking at them. It turned its collective gaze elsewhere, toward the newer storefronts along Calvert Street, toward the freshly painted church steeple, toward the railroad platform where real money arrived in leather satchels, carried by men in suits. And whatever the town chose to stop looking at simply waited, patient and silent, until it became part of the landscape the way an old tree stump becomes part of a field. Unremarkable, forgotten, and quietly full of something no one thought to check. The freight warehouse at the far end of Depot Row was one of those things. It stood apart from the cluster of buildings that made up the working end of Haller's Crossing, a long, low structure of dark timber and Missouri limestone. Its roof bowed slightly in the middle like the back of an overworked mule. The loading doors on its eastern face had been chained shut for 11 years. The windows, set high in the limestone walls, were sealed from the inside with boards that had warped and swollen until no draft moved through them. The concrete floor, unusual for a freight building in 1889, poured at considerable expense, people said, by the man who had commissioned the warehouse himself, was invisible now beneath years of grit and silence. There was a padlock on the chain securing those loading doors, a heavy, obsolete thing, the kind manufactured in St. Louis in the early 1870s by a company that had since gone out of business. No one in Haller's Crossing owned the key, or so they claimed. No one in Haller's Crossing would say plainly who had last been inside, and no one, not a single soul along the length of Depot Row, would explain why, when the wind came off the Kansas plain in a particular direction on certain autumn evenings, there was a faint and faintly sweet smell that drifted from the base of that limestone wall. Not decay exactly, not rot, something subtler, something older. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, 1889, a young woman named Cora Vess stood in front of that warehouse for the first time. She was 20 years old. She owned a carpetbag containing 3 dresses, a bread knife, a small ledger her father had given her, and $4.63. She had walked 11 miles in shoes whose left sole was beginning to separate from its upper, and her hem was dark with road mud to the knee. She looked at the warehouse for a long time. She looked at the padlock on the chain. She looked at the warped boards visible through the high windows, and at the crabgrass that forced itself through the gap between the limestone foundation and the packed earth of Depot Row. Then she turned and walked toward the county registrar's office. Stay with us. Cora had grown up in a house that smelled of pine resin and lamp oil, 60 miles south and east of Haller's Crossing, in the valley people called Remy's Hollow. Her father, Edmund Vess, had been a surveyor by training and a woodworker by devotion, and the house he had built, over 4 seasons, log by careful log, was the kind of structure that seemed to belong where it stood, as though the valley had grown it from itself. The joinery on the window frames was extraordinary. Edmund had a gift for understanding how things fit together, how one surface found another, how a well-cut joint could bear more weight than seemed possible. He passed this gift to Cora not through formal instruction but through proximity, through years of sitting at his workbench while the fire burned low, handing him chisels, holding pieces steady, learning to read wood grain the way another child might learn letters. Her mother, Agnes, had died of a fever when Cora was 9. There had been no ceremony beyond what Edmund and a neighbor could manage, no proper mourning period that anyone came to observe. Remy's Hollow was not the kind of place people traveled to. Afterward, Edmund grew quieter in ways that were difficult to describe, not sad exactly, or not only sad, but concentrated, as though grief had compressed him and made him denser. He still worked. He still lit the lamp in the morning and checked the survey lines on whatever commission kept them fed that season. He still told Cora, in his unhurried way, everything he knew about how to measure a piece of land so that its true dimensions could never be disputed. He taught her to read survey plats, to calculate bearing, to identify a corner marker even when it had been overgrown or moved. He taught her, without meaning to, how to determine whether a recorded boundary and a physical boundary were the same thing. They were not always the same thing. That was the first important lesson. The second lesson came from the county clerk's office in the market town of Sayersville, where Edmund occasionally brought Cora when he filed survey reports. The clerk was a spare, meticulous man named Horace Pell, who wore the same ink-stained cuffs every time Cora saw him, and who had above his desk a framed maxim that read, "A deed poorly read is a theft waiting to be discovered." Cora had asked him once what it meant. He had looked at her over the tops of his spectacles and said that most people who lost land did not lose it by force. They lost it because they never properly understood what they owned in the first place. That stuck. The way certain things stick to a young person before they have the vocabulary to explain why. Edmund Vest died in the spring of 1889, not from anything dramatic, no fall from a ridge, no accident with a saw, but from a pneumonia that settled in his chest during a wet February and simply refused to leave. He was 51. He left Cora the house, the tools, and a small leather-bound ledger in which he had kept notes on every survey commission he had ever completed. He left her also a debt to the Sayersville Merchant Bank, which he had never mentioned to her, and which was, she discovered after the funeral, larger than the house was worth. The bank's representative arrived in Remy's Hollow 6 weeks after Edmund was buried. He was polite. He had good boots and an unpleasant delicacy in the way he phrased things. Cora had 2 months, he told her. If she could not satisfy the debt, the property would be transferred. He was sorry for her loss. She spent those 2 months trying to find survey work in the surrounding counties, calling on every land office and county seat within a day's ride. She was 20 and a woman and had no official credentials, only her father's ledger and her father's knowledge, which she carried in her hands and her eyes and her capacity to read a plat more carefully than almost anyone she encountered. It was not enough. Not for the official ledger keepers of 1889, who required a name and a professional standing that Cora did not possess and could not acquire in 2 months. In August, she handed over the key to the Remy's Hollow house to the bank's representative, who this time did not offer condolences. She put her 3 dresses and her bread knife and her father's ledger into the carpet bag, counted what money remained, and began walking north and west toward the railroad line. She had heard from a freighter she met at a crossroads that the town of Haller's Crossing sometimes had work at the grain elevators in autumn. It was not much to go on, but it was a direction, and Cora had learned from Edmund that when the land gives you nothing else, it gives you a direction. You start walking that way, and you adjust as you go. She did not find work at the grain elevators. The harvest had been lean that year. A drought through June and July had stunted the wheat in the bottomlands, and the elevator crews were already as small as they could manage. The foreman, a thick-necked German named Beckert, told her without cruelty that he had nothing for her, and that the hiring hall on Calvert Street sometimes wanted women for domestic positions at the hotel. Cora thanked him and walked back down Depot Row. That was when she first saw the warehouse. She did not see it the way someone sees a promising thing. She was tired and her left shoe was failing, and the wind off the plain that afternoon carried a cold that promised early snow. What she saw was a building no one seemed to own or want, a locked thing that had been set aside. She understood, from her father's teaching, that things set aside in the public record sometimes carried more value than anyone remembered, because everyone had stopped looking. The county registrar's office was in the courthouse on the north side of Haller's Crossing's small central square. The registrar himself was not present. It was a Tuesday, and he only came in on Wednesdays and Fridays. But his assistant, a young man of perhaps 23, with a cowlick he seemed to be fighting a losing battle against, was willing to look up the parcel record for the freight warehouse on Depot Row when Cora asked him to. It took him the better part of 20 minutes. The record, when he found it, was in a ledger that had been filed in the wrong section and was therefore effectively invisible to casual inquiry. The warehouse had last been assessed in 1878. It was listed as the property of a business entity called the Haller Cross Freight Association. That entity, the assistant confirmed after another period of searching, had been dissolved in 1881 and had left no successor in title. The parcel had been in a state of delinquent taxes for 8 years. The accumulated debt was listed as $4.17. Cora asked whether the parcel could be purchased for the demount plus the registration fee. The assistant cowlick fellow blinked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He said he supposed it could, technically, yes. That was the law regarding tax-delinquent property, but that she would need to appear before the county judge to complete the transfer. The county judge was available Thursday mornings. Cora spent Tuesday and Wednesday sleeping under a wagon blanket behind the livery stable at the south end of Depot Row. She ate bread she purchased for 4 cents at the bakery on Calvert Street, and drank water from the pump in the courthouse square. She read her father's ledger by the light that came between the livery stable's boards in the mornings, studying his careful survey notes, his measured handwriting, the way he had recorded not just the dimensions of each commission but the details of what he found at each corner marker. A particular rock, the base of a cottonwood, a stake driven at an angle that suggested it might have been moved. On Thursday morning she appeared before Judge Calvin Rudd in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Calvin Rudd was 65, broad across the chest, with the measured, unhurried manner of a man who had decided long ago exactly how much could be accomplished in a day and had ceased to exceed that amount. He read the parcel record. He read it again. He looked at Cora over the tops of his glasses. She laid $4.17 on the desk between them. She laid 83 cents more, the registration fee, beside it. The judge recorded the transfer. The deed was signed. The warehouse at the end of Depot Row, its padlocked chain, its concrete floor, its sealed windows and their warped boards, its 11 years of silence and its particular autumn smell, all of it became the legal property of Cora Vess for a total of $5 even. Word traveled the length of Holler's Crossing by noon. By 2 o'clock, men who had not spoken to one another in weeks were speaking, and what they were saying ranged from amusement to something that was not quite amusement. A girl from nowhere, they said, paid $5 for Pemberton's old freight barn, for that crumbling limestone box at the end of Depot Row that smells like something died in it once. She paid $5 whole for that. Poor creature. Someone at the barber shop laughed so hard he spilled his coffee. Cora spent her last $1.63 on a box of tallow candles, a small tin of dried beans, a coil of rope, and a heavy-headed pry bar from the ironmonger's. She carried these back to the warehouse in her carpet bag and in her arms, set them against the limestone wall, and stood for a moment looking at the padlock on the chain. The lock was large and very old and had clearly been exposed to weather for years. Its keyhole was partly furred with rust, and the shackle had darkened to a deep brown. She studied its mechanism with the same careful attention her father had taught her to bring to joinery. A padlock was, after all, a kind of joint. Two surfaces meant to find each other and hold. She did not pick it. She had no tools for that and no particular knowledge of lock mechanisms. What she did was what Edmund Vess would have done. She examined the mounting hardware. The chain was threaded through iron rings bolted to the door frame, and the rings, she saw, had been bolted in haste and at an angle. The kind of hasty work done by someone under pressure, someone who wanted something closed quickly rather than closed correctly. The lag bolts that held the right-hand ring were barely set into the soft old timber of the door frame. She worked the ring back and forth with the pry bar, working slowly, letting the leverage do what impatience never could. And after perhaps 40 minutes the ring came free of the door frame with a sound like a question mark. She unwound the chain. She pulled the loading door open. The air that came out of the warehouse was cold and stale and strange, not rotten exactly, but thoroughly undisturbed, the way the air inside a sealed thing is always subtly different from any air that moves. Cora stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The warehouse was a single large room, perhaps 60 feet long and 30 wide. The concrete floor, gray-brown and cracked in several places, extended its full length. Iron hooks hung from the ceiling beams at intervals, freight hooks, the kind used to move heavy goods. Along the north wall, a row of heavy wooden shelving units stood empty, their surfaces thick with dust, several of them partially collapsed. At the far end of the room, beneath the highest of the sealed windows, there was a wooden desk and a chair, both collapsed, the chair on its side. The desk split across the middle, as though something heavy had been placed on it. And in the concrete floor, near the center of the room, there was a seam. Cora brought a candle and crouched to look at it. It was not a crack. The floor had cracks enough, thin lines of age and shifting. This was different. This was a seam, a deliberate line in the concrete, a join between two pores forming a rough rectangle perhaps 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. The concrete within the rectangle was slightly darker than the concrete surrounding it, newer. Poured after the original floor, she judged, by some years. She pressed her palm to it. The concrete there was solid, gave nothing. She set her candle on the floor and sat back on her heels and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, thinking. Then she went looking for tools. The ironmonger's name was August Saab. He was 68 years old, with enormous hands and a white beard so long and thick that a sparrow had once, famously, attempted to build a nest in its lower region. He had come to Holler's Crossing in 1861 from a German-speaking canton in Ohio and had been the town's ironmonger, smith, and general fixer of mechanical problems ever since. He was also, which was less commonly remarked upon, an excellent reader of people. He knew who Cora Vess was by the time she pushed open the door of his shop that Thursday afternoon. He had heard, as everyone had heard, about the girl who paid $5 for Pemberton's old freight barn. He had not laughed. He had simply gone quiet in the way a careful man goes quiet when something unexpected is introduced into a situation he thought he understood. He gave her a cup of coffee, strong, almost burnt, from an iron pot on the stove in the back corner, without asking whether she wanted one. He set it on the counter in front of her and looked at her hands while she described what she had found in the floor. Ironmongers develop a relationship with hands over a career. Hands tell stories that faces know to conceal. Cora's hands were calloused in the right places. The right palm thickened across the middle from tool handles, the left fingertips roughened from steadying work. These were hands that had done real labor since childhood. He asked, in his unhurried way, what she intended to do. She said she intended to find out what was under the floor. He said she would need chisels, and a heavy mallet, and patience, and probably another person to hold the light. He paused. He refilled his own coffee. He said that, if she needed assistance in holding the light, he had nothing of particular urgency on Friday morning. Cora looked at him. He had the directness of a man who does not make offers he does not intend to keep. She said Friday morning would suit her fine. August Saab nodded once and turned back to his workbench as though the matter were decided, which it was. They began at 7 in the morning, when the light through the open loading doors was thin and horizontal and very clean. August brought 2 lanterns, a set of cold chisels in descending sizes, a 4-pound mallet, and a flat-bladed bar for prying. Cora had spent Thursday evening sweeping the floor around the seam with a broom she had borrowed from the livery stable, clearing the accumulated grit so she could see the rectangle's full extent. It was, she confirmed, 4 feet by 5 feet. The seam was approximately a 1/4 inch wide, and when she tipped a candle over it and let a few drops of tallow fall in, they pooled rather than running. The underside of the seam was hollow, or nearly so. August Saab looked at this result without visible reaction. He said quietly that whoever had poured this section had done it over a wooden form rather than directly on soil. The form had compressed over years, leaving the slight void beneath the seam. He selected a chisel. He placed it at the edge of the seam, set the mallet against it, and looked at Cora. She nodded. He struck once. The chisel sank a 1/4 inch into the seam with a sound that was sharp and final in the cold air of the warehouse. They worked for 3 hours. The concrete in the rectangle was thinner than the surrounding floor, poured at perhaps 2 inches rather than 4, and broke in sections rather than all at once. August struck and Cora pried, lifting sections away and stacking them against the north wall. The concrete was pale gray on top and darker beneath where moisture had occasionally crept in from the soil below. When the last section lifted away, they both stopped and looked. Beneath the concrete rectangle there was a wooden hatch. It was set into a shallow pit perhaps 8 inches deep, and it was made of thick pine planks, tongue and grooved and braced beneath with iron strapping. A recessed iron ring served as its handle. The wood was discolored by years of near darkness and absorbed moisture, but it was solid, the kind of construction someone had intended to last. Around the hatch's edge, pressed between the pine and the concrete above it, was a thin bead of beeswax, deliberate, preserving. Cora lifted the iron ring and pulled. The hatch came up with a sound of suction releasing, 11 years of sealed air escaping in a long, cold exhalation, carrying with it the faintly sweet smell she now recognized from the base of the limestone wall. Not decay, preservation, the smell of beeswax and something drier. See sandalwood? Below the hatch, narrow wooden steps descended into a space that was not precisely a cellar, but something between a cellar and a vault, perhaps 5 feet deep and 8 feet square. The walls were faced with limestone block. The floor was dry-packed clay, and covering the floor, stacked and arranged with methodical care, were crates, oilcloth-wrapped bundles, a wooden cabinet with iron locks, and, leaning against the cabinet, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had been sewn shut along every seam the shape of a document box. Cora descended the steps. The air below was remarkably still and dry. She brought the lantern down and held it high, moving it slowly around the space. The crates were unmarked. The bundles were bound with cord. The cabinet was heavy, mahogany, she thought, from the color and the grain, an astonishingly fine piece for a freight storage vault. She went first to the oilcloth bundle leaning against the cabinet. She felt its dimensions through the cloth, flat, rigid, a portfolio or a case of some kind. She took her bread knife and cut the stitching along one seam. The oilcloth fell away. Inside was a document case of brown leather, latched with a small brass clasp. She opened it. The papers inside were perfectly preserved. Not merely dry but actively protected. The case had been lined with cedar panels, thin as veneer, fitted along the interior with the same care that her father had given his best joinery. Someone had understood that paper is fragile, that time and moisture and insects are patient enemies, and had applied that understanding with unusual thoroughness. The first document was a survey plat. Cora went very still. It was a survey plat for a parcel of land in Haller County, Missouri. The parcel was large. She estimated it at roughly 1,200 acres, based on the scale indicated at the bottom corner. It had been surveyed in 1872, and it bore in the bottom right corner, in handwriting she recognized as well as she recognized her own face in a mirror, the signature of Edmund Vess. Her father had surveyed this land, the specific land, 17 years ago, when she had been 3 years old. She set the plat aside with hands that had begun, very slightly, to tremble. Beneath it were letters, a dozen of them, bound with a ribbon that had once been blue and had faded to the color of pale water. She untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. It was dated June 14, 1873. It was addressed to a man named Cornelius Pemberton. She had heard that name. The warehouse, people had called it, Pemberton's old freight barn. The letter was from a land agent in St. Louis, and it described, in the careful language of business correspondence, the outlines of an arrangement, a land purchase, a survey to be recorded. Except, and Cora read this sentence 3 times to be certain, the survey to be recorded was not, the letter clarified, to be the survey actually completed in the field. A different version of the survey would be filed with the county register. A version that shifted the parcel's eastern boundary by some 1,400 feet. 1,400 feet, enough to exclude the entire western face of the limestone bluffs on the parcel's eastern edge. Cora knew, from her father's ledger, which she had with her, which she had been reading for 3 days in the livery stable, that those bluffs contained something. Her father had noted it in the margin of his survey entry for 1872. In the careful way he noted everything that seemed potentially significant, without stating outright what he thought it meant. Significant mineral seam visible at bluff face eastern section. Galena primarily may extend. Recommend geologic assessment, lead. Her father had found a lead seam in 1872. He had noted it in his private ledger. She read the next 3 letters in quick succession, her hands fully trembling now, evidently reported his finding to the landowner of record at the time, a widow named Clara Brecht, who had inherited the parcel from her husband. And Clara Brecht, who apparently had not yet been approached by Cornelius Pemberton, had written to her brother in St. Louis asking his advice on what a lead seam might be worth. Her brother had then, apparently, written to Cornelius Pemberton, and Pemberton had moved with extraordinary speed. The letters in the bundle told the story in fragments, each one a piece of a picture that only became clear when they were arranged in order, which Cora did, sitting cross-legged on the dry clay floor of the vault with the lantern beside her, and August Saab's footsteps moving quietly above her head as he waited. The story was this. Pemberton had purchased the Brecht parcel in the summer of 1873 for a price that was fair by the standards of farmland, but would have been laughably insufficient for land containing a significant lead deposit. He had accomplished this by ensuring that the survey filed with the county register. The official survey, the one Clara Brecht had been shown, described a parcel whose eastern boundary stopped well short of the limestone bluffs. On paper, the bluffs were not part of what she was selling. She had sold what she believed she owned, which was exactly what Cornelius Pemberton had arranged for her to believe she owned. The survey her father had actually completed, the true survey with the correct boundary, was in Cora's hands. The one filed in the county register was a forgery. Her father's signature appeared on both, on the true survey in his own hand. On the county register's version, she found a copy of it in the document case, folded behind the letters, in a hand that was close but not quite right. Someone had practiced his signature and done a reasonable job of it, not perfect. Edmund Vess made a particular movement at the end of his capital V that this copyist had flattened to something straighter, something neater, something that lacked the small characteristic lift that Cora had watched her father's pen make 10,000 times. She sat for a long time in the vault, in the lantern's quiet circle of light, with the documents arranged around her on the clay floor. She thought about Clara Brecht, who had sold bluffland she did not know she owned for money that had already been spent. She thought about the lead seam in those bluffs, and whether it had been worked, and by whom, and for how long. She thought about the fact that her father, Edmund Vess, whose name had been forged on a document filed in a county courthouse, had died of pneumonia in February of 1889, without ever knowing that his professional integrity had been falsified in the public record. She thought about the debt at the Searsville Merchant Bank. the debt Edmund had never mentioned, the one that had appeared after his death, larger than the house was worth. She began to think about that debt very carefully. August Saab helped her carry the document case and the letter bundle up from the vault and into the warehouse. He set them on the concrete floor, in the long pale light from the open loading doors, and he stood aside while Cora sat on the floor and read. He did not ask questions. He went once to fetch coffee from his shop and returned with 2 cups. He mended a broken hinge on the warehouse's loading door with tools from his bag, quietly, while she read. When she had read everything twice, she told him what she had found. He listened with the complete stillness of a man who is truly listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. He asked whether the survey plat had been properly witnessed at the time of its completion. She checked. It had, by 2 signatures she did not recognize, but which could presumably be traced. He asked whether any of the letters directly named the person who had forged Edmund's signature. They did not directly, but the second-to-last letter in the bundle, written in 1878, a year before the warehouse was sealed and abandoned, was from a man named H. Galt, who described himself as having completed certain drafting and technical work for Pemberton in the summer of 1873, and who was now requesting payment of an outstanding balance, implying that Pemberton owed him money for services rendered at that time, services that Galt described with a care so elaborate that its carefulness was itself a kind of confession. August Saab read this letter once. He handed it back to Cora. He said in his measured way that he thought the county judge was a man of integrity. Cora said she had formed the same impression. He said that the county recorder's office in Jefferson City maintained original copies of all filed surveys, and that a comparison between the county file and the original field plat would likely settle the question of which was authentic, since field plats contained notations that forgers rarely thought to include. Cora thought of the mineral notation her father had made in his private ledger. Galena primarily may extend. She thought of whether such a notation might have originally appeared, on the filed survey before it was replaced. She went to her carpet bag and retrieved her father's ledger. She opened it to the entry for 1872. She read the margin notation. Then she read the entry itself, in Edmund's careful hand, and found 3 lines from the bottom of the survey description, a reference to the eastern boundary markers and their relationship to the bluff face that was specific enough, precise enough in its measurements, that it could only have been written by someone standing at that boundary. The forged survey would not have those measurements. It could not, because the forger had never stood there. Cora closed the ledger. She pressed her hand against its cover for a moment. Then she asked August Saab if he would be willing to accompany her to Judge Rudd's office on Friday afternoon. He said he would bring his coffee. What followed was not fast, and it was not simple, and it was not anything like the stories that would later circulate through Holler's Crossing and the surrounding counties about the girl who bought the old freight barn for $5 and turned it into justice. Stories simplify. They cut away the weeks of correspondence, the 2 trips to Jefferson City, the careful comparison performed by a state land examiner named Parkhurst, who spent 4 days with both surveys and the original field notes, and emerged from the exercise with a written opinion that ran to 11 pages and was worded with the precision of a man who understood that his words would be challenged. They cut away the interviews with 2 elderly residents of Haller County who remembered, dimly but usefully, a woman named Clara Brecht and a transaction that had seemed, at the time, to move with unusual speed. They cut away the discovery, in the Haller County probate records, that Clara Brecht had died in 1881 without heirs, and that her estate, such as it was, had been administered by the county, and that the estate had listed no interest in land, because Clara Brecht had by then already sold what she believed to be all of it. They cut away, most significantly, the finding that Cornelius Pemberton, who had left Holler's Crossing in 1881, which was why the warehouse had been abandoned and sealed, and the debt on the parcel had accumulated for 8 years, had relocated to Kansas City, where he was now a substantial investor in a mining concern that had, in the intervening years, extracted a considerable quantity of lead ore from a series of limestone bluffs in Haller County, Missouri, on land whose legal ownership it now developed was considerably less clear than Mr. Pemberton had represented to his investors. The man named H. Galt, when found in Sedalia by a county sheriff's deputy following up on a matter of public record, proved to be in poor health and poor spirits, and possessed of a guilty conscience that had been weighing on him, he admitted, for the better part of 16 years. He was willing, with what the DBA reported as an almost visible relief, to provide a sworn statement. Cornelius Pemberton did not go to prison. This was 1889, and the law moved in particular channels, and a man of Pemberton's resources had access to counsel that Cora did not. What happened instead was quieter and, in its way, more complete. The lead mining operation on the disputed Bluff land was enjoined pending a determination of title. The determination, when it came, established that the true boundary of the Brecht parcel, as confirmed by the original survey plat and its field notes, had never been legally transferred from Clara Brecht's estate. It had been fraudulently excluded. The land reverted to the county under the estate administration, and the county, acting on a petition supported by Judge Rudd and documented by August Saab and several others who had reason to believe in its merits, awarded the survey easement rights to the only person who had, in any meaningful sense, discovered and preserved the evidence that made the determination possible. Pemberton left Kansas City. He went somewhere west and unremarkable, and the people who had invested their money in his lead operation spent a number of unpleasant years in negotiation with their lawyers. Whether Pemberton ever arrived somewhere quiet and lived peacefully is not recorded anywhere. What is recorded is that he was never, after 1891, a man of consequence. The Sayersville Merchant Bank debt had of course been cleared. Cora had examined it carefully once she understood the larger picture, had requested the original loan documents under the terms her father's estate was entitled to, had found that Edmund Vess had taken the loan not for any personal expenditure, but as surety for a commission that a client had subsequently failed to honor. The client's name was familiar from the document case. Edmund had likely known what Pemberton had done, had likely been pressured in ways that Cora would never fully understand. The debt had been a kind of weight, she thought, a thumb on the scale. It had been discharged, in the end, as a fraud upon the estate. She did not become wealthy. The easement rights carried a modest annual income, enough to live carefully and with deliberation. The warehouse itself she repaired over the following winter, with August Saab's guidance and her own capable hands. She replaced the warped window boards with actual glass, fitted new timber shelves along the north wall, laid a proper wood floor over the cracked concrete where the vault had been. The vault she sealed again properly. Its contents transferred to the county recorder's archive in Jefferson City, where they belonged. She opened a survey office in the warehouse, the first in Holler's Crossing. She had no official credentials and spent several years corresponding with the state surveyor's office until the rules that prevented a woman from holding a licensed survey commission were revised, which they eventually were, in the inevitable, grinding way that certain things are eventually revised when a person simply refuses to stop writing letters and presenting evidence. In the meantime, she worked. August Saab brought her clients in his unhurried way. Judge Rudd referred boundary disputes to her, unofficially, when he wanted a reliable reading before a formal proceeding. The county examiner Parkhurst, after working with her plat analysis during the Pemberton determination, wrote her a letter of professional respect that she kept, folded, in her father's ledger alongside his 1872 survey entry. She hired an assistant in the spring of 1891, a young man of 17 who had been trying to teach himself arithmetic from a borrowed school book and who had the particular quality, rare and valuable, of knowing what he did not know and being willing to ask. She taught him the way her father had taught her, by proximity, by practice, by making the work available to curious hands. The warehouse smelled finally of cedar and lamp oil, of cut lumber and the sharp mineral tang of good ink, of coffee which August Saab brought in a tin pail every Friday morning, and which Cora had come to regard as one of the small, reliable gifts of a life she had not expected and could not have planned. On certain evenings in autumn, when the wind came off the Kansas plain in a particular direction, she would stand in the open loading door of the warehouse and watch the light change over Depot Row. The sky in that direction, at that hour, had the quality of old brass, warm and slightly tarnished, deeper than you expected it to be. The freight hooks still hung from the ceiling beams. She had decided to leave them. They were part of the building's story, and the building's story was, in some sense, the only story she had been given to start with. She had started with a locked door and $5, and the knowledge, learned at her father's knee, that the recorded version and the true version of a thing are not always the same. She had followed the difference. That was all. That was everything. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Holler's Crossing and the quiet, stubborn courage of Cora Vess. She never set out to find justice. She simply followed what was true, one careful measurement at a time. Here is something to think about. Edmund Vest knew or suspected what had been done with his survey and chose to remain silent. Was he protecting Cora himself? Or was he simply a man who had been given no good options? We'd love to hear what you think in the comments below.